Tanya, welcome back to Crime World. And we're going to update ourselves a little bit on the Katie Simpson murder investigation, if there's anything left to investigate there, and to what's happening with all the various inquiries into the failures in that and what happened with Jonathan Creswell, who, of course, took his own life as his trial got underway for murder. The first thing I wanted to ask you was, can you explain to me what a Public Protection Arrangements Northern Ireland is?
I can. Thank you, Nicola, for having me back on again. It comes under an acronym Panny, and this is a group of public agencies all working together. That's police, probation board, prison service, health trusts, anybody who would have a role in protecting the vulnerable. But they also are under this one umbrella. It's usually chaired by an independent panel member. But in the like of Creswell's case, where we think it would have been, all the agencies who would have worked with him would have got together and assessed the risk that he presented on his release from prison.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that would have perhaps looked at his compliance while in prison. Well, obviously the nature of the charges for a start, how he behaved in prison, who visited him, how he treated them when he visited them. Did he engage in any courses about anger management, for example, about respecting relationships, and just generally how he behaved. The police would then say, well, we feel there's a risk or there isn't a risk. And then a health trust, for example, who would have maybe input into people around Creswell would say, well, we feel he's not a risk here, but he could be a risk here. And I think what was always standing out there was that Johnny was going to be a risk to any female. It was recently described to me that no female from 6 to 60 was safe. So then you have they get together and they form a category package. So there are about 4 different levels, possibly 3, of offender. And they are monitored. There would be, he would, for example, have had to regularly check in for possibly with probation, possibly with a risk manager, to ensure that he was not breaking any rules, putting him in places of risk. None of that happened. Now, arrangements did change. They were very much upgraded in 2010, April 2010. They got tighter. And then I think it was about 2015, Northern Ireland got its equivalent of Sarah's Law, which is even more stringent than Sarah's Law in England. Ours is called the Child Protection Disclosure Scheme, which went long past a sex offender, for example. We haven't got proper statistics on how well it's working, but it put it in law that you have the right to ask if a person is at risk to the child, not only from sexual offending, but from violent offending, domestic, anything along those lines. So there's extra packaging there around these instances. And in the main, it generally works well because it's multi-agency. That said, I don't like the term of a panel being made of multi-agency because it's a circle of people, each representing their own, and they will inevitably say, well, it was a multi-agency decision. If they get it wrong, for example, multi-agency, okay, let's see each individual's input. Oh, we can't show you that. So they'll always have that circle to pass it round and pass it round. There needs to be someone who makes a decision and records that the decision isn't substantiated or something along those lines. But when you bring in multiple varying agencies who have varying roles, some of them they'll agree and some of them won't, and they go, oh, well, I suppose it's human rights, we'll just have to let it go. And that to me is not good enough. I'm wary of getting answers for saying, oh, it wasn't just us. For example, I tackled the police on an issue recently. I said, oh, it wasn't just us that came to that conclusion. It was a multi-agency. So let's have them all. In this instance, Johnny just kept getting missed.
So the Justice Minister, Naomi Long, has now commissioned a review to establish whether or not sort of opportunities were missed to refer him to this Panny. which was that this multiple agency thing you're discussing. So are you talking about from 2010 when he was being released after a conviction for a horrific violent attack on Abby Lyle? And, you know, a decade before he goes on to murder Katie Simpson, stage her death as a suicide, and pretty much damn nearly gets away with that. So is that the timeline you're looking back to see should something have been put in place and to see what risk he was?
It can only go back to when he became an offender, and he becomes an offender the moment he's convicted. So yes, prior to that, he'd no convictions. Although there was quite a disturbing toing and froing about non-molestation orders, but none of them ever made it to court. But there were court orders in place to keep him away from individuals. But because it didn't reach court, there's very little you could really build that on. However, he was released from prison, and that was it.
Yeah.
There was no supervision, there was no monitoring, there was no anything. And that is where he should have been picked up first. The minute he was being released, there should have been a plan, a risk assessment, call it what you will, because the offences for which he was jailed were particularly serious. Notwithstanding that, it was his first offence. So in the main, a first offence is usually dealt with not by custody. But again, there are instances. It was a pitifully short sentence, but in many ways, the judge's hands were tied. He did plead, so he gets time. He gets credit for that. But I remember sitting through that sentencing, and he was portrayed as this pathetic little individual who could not explain why he had done what he did. He was mystified by it, and he was so hurt by his own actions. And he cowered in the dock. He was a lot smaller then than he was whenever he was in the Katie case. He was considerably smaller. He was still an active jockey, so he was tiny. Well, small, I wouldn't say tiny. And he's actually weeping in the dock as he's told, no, you're going to jail. And he does his 3 months, obviously 3 months remission, 50% remission. And he comes out and just picks up where he left off. There was absolutely no change, apart from the fact that for 3 months he was not in the community. But he goes back to the exact community, the exact industry, which attracts females predominantly, young females, which we now know were Johnny's attraction, and his grooming began all over again. I don't even know while he was on bail if he broke his stride, because he was on quite strict conditions that he wasn't allowed to do certain things. But I can remember seeing him show jumping at a county show, and he was in great form, surrounded by girls, the month before he got sentenced. So we're not talking about a man who was in any way perturbed by either the thought of prison or the end result of what it did. It taught him nothing. Nothing. So a very, but I think in some ways he knew somehow how to avoid scrutiny, because nobody's that lucky.
I suppose just to remind ourselves, I mean, there was a series of horrendous attacks on Abby Lyle, who was his then girlfriend, and he obviously had a lot of control, held a lot of control over her. She went on to speak openly and very bravely about that and how she sort of found herself in a relationship like that. But, you know, he had taken her keys. There was a kind of a pattern involved in what he used to do. He'd get very, very jealous. He'd deprive her of her phone. Sometimes he would put her into the car and beat her in the car while it was moving. On one occasion, he'd taken her over the border to Castle Leslie, where he'd was probably the most serious attack was then. And she would have said that he could have killed her any one of those times. But as the law stood back then, I don't think that pattern was able to create an overarching case against him. The incidents had to be taken as individual charges, which kind of went in his favour nearly, didn't it?
in any sentencing, it's done on a global angle. I mean, I think there were 6 assaults, but there were definitely, on different dates, but they were specimen counts. So they sentence you globally. They look at the whole picture and they say, right, this is what it's going to be. But one of the things that changed a lot was the introduction. Several new laws have come in the last few years, one of which was non-fatal strangulation. Had that been a charge, because Abby was choked, we know that. She choked until she passed out. Had that been a standalone charge as opposed to what it was then, which was assault occasioning actual bodily harm, that would have changed things specifically. Plus, he was charged with kidnapping Abby, but in his plea deal, in admitting the assaults, he got the kidnapping charge dropped. That related, as you said, to the driving over the border and detaining her in the car in the process and smashing her phone and having taken control of it. And these are the echoes that came back in Katie's case. It's nearly carbon copy and it's frighteningly close. And we were just thinking about the bravery of Abby, and Abby survived. But I don't think anybody's under any delusion that Abby came very, very close. Katie was the one who didn't revive. But when you've had 10 years of getting away with absolutely brutal behaviour, not challenged, never caught, never brought to book, never monitored, allowed free rein.
Yeah. You're empowered.
He was empowered. He also seemed to be very, he quite enjoyed me putting people in fear. And that's quite a frightening aspect, because I was talking recently to the police officer who removed Abby from the house, and she said about him squaring up to her. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've known her for nearly 30 years and I wouldn't dare square up to her. This man only comes up to her chest, but he fully defied her. He was, you get out of my face. And she very calmly just says, Abby, get your things, we're leaving. But that's the bravado, the defiance, and that developed because he was never, no lines were ever drawn. I don't know if Panny arrangements would have made a difference. I'd say things would have been a lot more difficult for him to get away with. But there remains this very strong adoration that even people he abused were stepping forward and saying, no, not Johnny, no. And that is quite frightening, because there has to come a cut-off point when they go, my goodness, what if it's me next? What if I'm the one who doesn't wake up? It is a terrifying prospect.
And Tanya, as regards his staying on the Abby Lyle case just for the moment, of course, the judge, Judge McFarland, I think it was, in Dungannon Court, basically said at the end of the sentencing that he had to assess him under the terms of the Criminal Justice Northern Ireland order to see was he dangerous after conviction. And this is a standard test, he said, is whether there's a significant risk of serious harm. I've considered all this, and I'm quoting the judge, and my view is that while there is potentially a risk of future harm, I don't think I could categorise that as a serious risk. In the circumstances, I find that you are not dangerous. Now, I'm not criticising the judge for saying what he did at that time before he sentenced him to the 6 months in custody. He was dealing with what he had in front of him, which included quite a lot of, I think there was a lot of letters put to the court, wasn't there, in Creswell's favour. He was a first-time offender, etc., etc. Would that have had any bearing, a judge stating that, on whether or not somebody was, seen as high risk on release?
The 2008 Act was a brilliant order that came in, but it's very, very hard to get past the threshold. It's the term dangerous can mean that you have an indeterminate sentence. There are a lot of factors that feed in to read that. A first offence would needed to have been, I hate saying this, but it would have needed to have been significantly more brutal. If it could have been, there would have been, the probation board would have had to say, he's no remorse. Well, he did. He broke down in the interview when he was being spoken to for his pre-sentence report. He was in tears and he was very emotional. He was emotional in court. He had pleaded guilty. A dangerous offender is someone who has usually challenged the system, remains hostile to the victim and the system and everything that goes with it. None of those factors were in play. So the judge couldn't have found him dangerous under the terms of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And I accept he's dealing with somebody who's in his early 20s, and he's hoping that with these wonderful references that he's got and the prospect of employment, that he's learned his lesson. How wrong. Now, we all probably sit in court and look at people and say, oh, he'll be back, or ones that go, I think he's caught on now. And it can work. The system can work. But to be absolutely just the doors open of the jail, out you go. Thanks for your stay. No, he should have had to undergo even psychiatric assessment, because underneath all of Johnny's control, there was a narcissist, a psychopathic narcissist, who could not be thwarted and used his physical strength and everything else that he could get his hands on to mete out retribution for anybody who defied him. So in terms of dangerous, it couldn't have happened. Maybe it should have, but with all this wonderful, the reports coming back were good. I don't think he was psychiatrically assessed. That would normally now be almost a given. I don't really think it was ever on the cards, because first offence, couldn't explain why he did it. Short relationship, okay, it was violent, and I think all that had to. He would have needed to have been caught again within about a year with a different situation, and that may have triggered the dangerousness. I think had he been convicted in Katie's case, he most definitely would have been found dangerous. I have no doubt in my mind about that. But as I said, that he almost got off on the idea of I can get round you all. I'm untouchable. I'm invincible, and there's nothing will fan the ego more than the success of getting away with stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And to move on to Katie Simpson, who tragically died in hospital 8 days, I think, after she was admitted by Johnny Creswell. He had taken her from a home, claiming he'd found her hanging, and had driven towards the hospital, was stopped on the side of the road where an ambulance met him. But it was too late. It would prove too late for Katie. Now, you and others at the time were agitating to try and get the police to look at this guy, Johnny Creswell, who had brought her to hospital, to look at his story, to look at the crime scene and other aspects of it the condition she was in when she got into hospital in the first place. And members of the hospital staff were also trying to get something going on it, but it took months. And it took into the following year, the January of 21, for the murder investigation to be launched. Up until that point, between the August and until then, Johnny Creswell carried on with life regardless. There's a lot of criticism there in relation to the original police investigation, what happened, what occurred in the hospital. We have a number of complaints being made to the police ombudsman and to other agencies. Where is all of that at the moment?
At the moment, the first complaint that we made back in 2021, and there were a number of us, but I specifically wanted to know, was my complaint being rejected? Because I wasn't allowed to make a complaint for long enough because I wasn't a family member. Was my complaint being rejected because I was press? Because that was very much held against me whenever I was ringing in to try and say, look, and they pulled me on that. How do you know him?
This essentially, your complaint, as you're describing it, was actually while you were trying to ring up to tell police, I know this guy, I sat in court, I heard the details of the case he was convicted for. There was strangulation. You had a really bad feeling from the very, very beginning that this was not as seemed, and you wanted to just pass on that information just in case the police in Derry didn't have it.
I wanted that, and I also had done a lot of work about exploitation, and the information that was being fed to me was very suggestive that Katie was being exploited. Now, at that point, we didn't know to what extent. It was only as the case went on, we learned it was financial, but she was physically, emotionally, every kind of exploit that you could think of. She was a workhorse. She was just kept very low. Hard work, exhausted from work, so exhausted she could never get out with her friends. A lot of stories like this, and little to no pay. She did have a job with another trainer, but it was part-time, and he was very, very good to her. But for the hours of work that Katie put in, she was simply, it was too much. So I wanted to raise that as well, but nobody was interested. So when we go back to the Ombudsman report, we finally get it going. It was another 2 years before that report was released to the PSNI. That was in May 2023, but we couldn't get anything about it because the trial was pending and nobody was allowed to interfere with that. After the trial collapses, technically, and after the women are sentenced, other issues came to light.
Just to remind those who don't recall, the trial of Jonathan Creswell collapsed because he took his own life. He was discovered dead the morning of the second day of that trial. 3 women, Hayley Robb, Jill Robinson and Rosemont Morency Wright, were subsequently convicted, having pleaded guilty to basically covering it up.
Yes, they were convicted of covering up the fact they knew he assaulted Katie the night before. And that meant washing clothes, and there were varying levels among what each of them did. So that was the drawbridge came down. That was the end of it. So then we suddenly find out at a policing board meeting that the PSNI have read the report. They very much played it down, and they said, "Oh, there's a professional misconduct. It's nothing major," and which I couldn't understand, given this was a murder. And in November, it reported in part. Now, we only learned through a press release from the Ombudsman that they'd had to remove references to a number of individuals. It's within that report, which is still not public and can't be, obviously, until it fully concludes, because new complaints had come in and there was some overlap. So we have to understand that. Now, one complaint relates to an incident in which there was a potential breach of confidence and a number of other matters within the second investigation, and that's being looked at as potential professional misconduct. The other matter is much more serious and is potentially criminal misconduct. And that relates to the first investigation. Why it wasn't picked up first time round, that's anybody's guess. We don't know. But there's still a long wait ahead of us. We don't know when we're going to hear on that, although the Ombudsman has assured they have put the resources into trying to get this finalised. And that's where we are, which is really not that far on, except that the wheels are turning to a degree. The review is very much welcomed. But again, it's only going to be a lessons learned issue that, it's retrospective. This could have happened and this could have been prevented. Well, I don't know. There's an awful lot of public authority legal speak where they use that line, it couldn't have been predicted and it couldn't have been prevented. Well, how do you know? Because we can't predict anything. We can barely predict the weather, but you can put measures in place that could at least try to prevent it. So it's not going to have any influence on Katie and her memory or justice. It is simply going to be, at least we can identify when he slipped through the net, because Johnny became adept at slipping through the net. I actually think he quite enjoyed it. It was almost like being on the run, because everything seemed to be just a big joke. But he still knew. He knew authorities were looking for him in 2016 over the exposure incident when he skipped the border. So he knew there were consequences coming. But what happened to the alert on the PSNI system to find him? Now, the victim of that complained to the Ombudsman, and they gave her a list of things which had been shown to have been done in trying to find him. And then the PPS said, no case, no prosecution. Well, it took us 3 days to disprove the vast majority of what is in that report from the Ombudsman declining her complaint. So she's reopened that. And we've given them 3 days is all it took us, and not exactly applying ourselves every day. It simply sat down, found some work, did a bit of work, and got the proof. So if we can do that, and we don't have anything like the access to systems that PSNI have.
Is that an incompetence, or is there just a resistance to try and dig down into the weeds of what happened, what went so badly wrong in this case?
You know, I can't answer that. I wish I could, but part of me is saying incompetence once or twice you could understand, but this has been the whole way through. It's been a running theme. And somewhere along the line, surely luck in those circumstances runs out. There's just been too many incidents. I think there may have been an element of, well, let's leave that on the back burner, and if it bubbles up again, well, we'll know what to do. But, you know, this is a man who's playing cat and mouse with the police. And I'm wondering, was he the cat and they were the mouse? Because he kept on winning.
You would think that when when you look at his story. What I wanted to ask you was, as regards a criminal investigation, so Katie Simpson obviously is dead. She has been murdered. Jonathan Creswell, the suspect for her murder, is dead. He took his own life. But clearly, and there was 3 women convicted of essentially, helping him to cover up the fact that he'd assaulted her the night before, specifically that, because all 3 of them pleaded guilty on the basis that they didn't know he had killed Katie. They simply believed that he had assaulted her, which was something he seemed to do very regularly to her. But all those other complaints that came in, because the floodgates opened, didn't they, after the murder investigation was launched and after he was charged with Katie Simpson's death. Other people came forward who'd been assaulted, who'd been sexually touched, and other incidents with them, who he threatened. Like, did he do it all alone? All of it?
I think the assaults, the physicality of that was alone. But I cannot believe that one man was able to carry out such a horrendous,
It's a catalogue of coercive control and abuse.
Well, if you even think of one soldier within an army who goes into battle, one is going to do nothing. He needs the troops to back him up. So I think a lot of people looked away. I think there is a mindset that if you look the other way, it didn't happen. I wouldn't want that in my conscience, nor would the people who did come forward who said, look, even if they call us mad, we're reporting this. I don't know if there was a club, but there were certainly a number of people who Johnny could rely on. And that was ably demonstrated when he has one remove clothes to wash them and he has others lying and lying and lying. Now let's think about that. You're lying about a life, not about stolen sweets, not about something, that maybe is tricky, but it's not going to. This is their life is ebbing away. And people were putting this out about Katie being in this horrendously dark place and how she said goodbye to the children in a different way that morning. And this is, how would they know if Johnny hadn't told them that? There's far too much there of that devotion, that obsession. The question I want to know is why? What was in it for them? Was it to be Johnny's pet for a day? Was it that he would throw it all away and run away into the sunset with them, turning his back on all others? How was that loyalty going to be rewarded? Because there is no reward in those circumstances, not at all. And the people couldn't have been thinking straight. The other thing is, a lot of people are saying, did he have something on people? Well, is that still enough to hold you back from saying about when there's a life? Because who was going to be next? This man carried on for a number of months in the same company with young women and other people, unfettered. There was no holding him back. Who was going to be next? Who was the next person who said, for example, no, I'm not doing that, Johnny? Who could have ended up on the ground? The man was unpredictable. He could not control his temper. For a man who lived a life of controlling others, the one person he couldn't control was himself.
And, a lot of those people, they come across almost mesmerised by a kind of a cult leader being Johnny.
It seems that's another phrase that has been used a lot, because there are, whilst his main peer group were women, there are a few men in there who thought him funny and, good fun, but in the main, it was women. And, I do feel sorry for them. I have to be honest, because anybody who is prepared to sacrifice their life or risk their life or their future for this individual who is literally living from day to day in one crisis after another, why would you want? You're not going to be his savior. You're not going to be the one who turns him into a good person. He's not even that good to you. So why are you joining the ranks of these other women to march along? What was that program on TV where the women were all kept very low and the men had full control of the situation except for the important wives? But Handmaid's Tale, is that what you want? Is in the 21st century, is that what you feel? Is that all you're good for? Did he break them to that level? He certainly broke them to the level he would weary of them. Having started grooming from a very early age, he then got tired of them in and about the 2021, but they couldn't let him go. They couldn't move away from him. And he didn't want them out of his grip either.
And within all that and those other allegations that were brought to the table as part of the murder inquiry and the case that had been, developed against him for the courts, is there any further investigation? Is there any other criminality suspected, or is this simply over?
It's not over, but they won't give us anything further. Katie's murder case is closed. But the police are being very, very coy and not engaging at all. There's a lot of other information coming forward. There are a lot of decisions to be made. There was information coming in at very late stages, which may have gone through the trial process, but when you take it all away, it was Creswell was on trial for Katie's murder and he can no longer be tried. But there are issues on the periphery that need to be looked at, are being looked at, but we cannot get any detail.
And probably the biggest issue is what you describe as, his luck, but the repeated failings of all those systems that are there in place to protect young women and all of us. All those systems seem to fail again and again and again in this case. And really, is that where or what should be on trial?
It has to be on trial. And the only way you're going to get that is a public inquiry. But it's interesting what you said there about you're looking at a system where this case had this, and this. Is it just this case? Is it just Katie's case or Creswell's case, call it what you will, which is so badly handled, so messed up? Is this a unique set of continuous mistakes? Or are we looking at a public authority or authorities who have let matters like this roll on before? And Katie's case was another one just put into that category. The reason Katie's is different is we were not going to stop shouting. And when the police finally caught on that we weren't going away, and we were not, to quote a certain individual who put to us, we were not trying to make a murder out of a suicide, and that we were going to keep going until we got some level of acceptance of what we were saying, things did change. But that was only the start. You know, you thought you'd got over the worst hump. But after that, it was just obstruction, frustration, delay, messed up this, messed up that. It was too much. And either that has been a case in point example of bad policing and every authority that came in under it with it. I don't just want to blame the PSNI, or this is endemic and people just maybe haven't spoken up before or knew to speak up. But as far as I'm concerned, Katie was worth the effort. And just other people. I know there are a number of investigations now being looked at again, which I'm delighted about, all in domestic circumstances where concerns were raised but shut down. Not all were suicide, I might add. Some were accidental death, which other people insisted were not. So it's wonderful that that's happening. But are we looking at a pattern? And was Katie's case the catalyst to make sure there is never another case as badly handled or mishandled is probably the better word, that never happens again? Is her case one of many, or is it the only one? In either instance, we need answers to that. Why was it just Katie's case? Or why has this been allowed to go on unchallenged for so long?
And there you're in the arena, as you say, of a public inquiry or a tribunal. So who seeks that? Who looks for that? Who has to stand up and shout for that?
Well, we've been shouting for it for quite a while. I can't even remember the date, because we're back to the multi-agency arena here. There have been so many agencies with a role here, and everybody, including some who misinterpreted their own governance, I might add, everybody needs to look at this and say, well, we could have done this, or we ignored that. I had a very disturbing phone call perhaps 3 weeks ago of a woman who she was really emotional, and she had known of Creswell from a distance, you know, some out a few times in groups, but she recalled seeing a very obvious breach of bail in the maybe the month before his trial was to begin, and she reported that, and it was dismissed. And she said about, you know, why did they not even try and check? And she said, you know, maybe he could have been lifted and he would have been in jail. But maybe they did check. Maybe it was unfounded, but nobody told her. And then she said she spoke to another person about it recently who said they had also witnessed it. So there were two individuals. One spoke out, okay, one didn't at the time. And she's now banging her head off a wall. Why didn't she push it? Because he would have been remanded, hopefully, so close to trial, breaching bail. He would have been remanded and very possibly would have been saved from ending his own life, and the trial could have gone ahead. So, and you know, how many people were looking away or not taking matters seriously? There's no other way to put it. Johnny had found a way of slipping through, either by luck, and I don't know how much luck the man had. He seemed to do very, very well, or something was negligent in not chasing up. Maybe he did the Johnny charm, or, oh, no, sir, I didn't do any such thing. Wonder how often that happened. I know I was admonished when I rang in and said about, you know, for about the fourth time, and I said that this man is quite lethal. This man is devastated. How can you say such a thing? He's devastated. He's in pieces. You know, so.
What were Johnny Creswell's bail conditions?
his bail conditions were rigid. There's no doubt about it. He was not. It must have been 26 or 27 people. He was not allowed contact with. He was supposedly not meant to work anywhere where there were young women. At one stage, it was no women at all. There was a time he wasn't allowed to go to horse fairs or shows or sales. He had to live at a specific address. His mother put up £5,000 in cash. Originally, whenever he was first granted bail, it was up £30,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's how serious this was originally treated, but he still was getting bail. But over time, there was just no way of getting that money. The people who had put up bail, one by one, pulled out whenever it was made known what they had done.
Mm-hmm.
And the revulsion of the public was just so bad. So it whittled away down until it was £5,000, which his mother eventually put up. And he wasn't allowed to, for example, I don't think he was allowed to drive, but he was allowed to be a passenger in certain people's car. And for at least a year and a half, he had to sign every day at Strand Road Police Station in Derry. Very, very tight, stringent conditions. Ironically, he seemed to manage to hold to most of them, but he got a little bit relaxed towards the end. Maybe thought, in for a penny, in for a pound, I don't know. But one of the things that it was quite startling, that way he was subject to bail checks as well. Johnny, on one occasion, which was all confirmed in court, the police called to do a bail check and Johnny was lying unconscious. Johnny had tried to overdose. Now, apart from that being a safeguarding issue, this is a man on bail for very serious offences who has just shown a propensity that he may be pushed enough to act in such a way as to get away from it.
Mm.
He was taken to hospital, he was treated, and he was released. Now, whether they didn't see the attempt as serious or a cry for help, or call it what you will, but he should have been immediately red flagged that this was a risk, because your bail terms are there to get you to court, to get the case safe and over the line. But Johnny is able to make a significant attempt, or at least appear to make a significant attempt, self-harm, and he goes home. Now, that should have been flagged up immediately, because what way did he do it in the end? Johnny took his own life. So it was not alien to him to have this on his history. Maybe somebody didn't take him seriously. But either way, we've plenty of people coming to court who are just about to get bail on a very serious charge at the police station and then say, when I go out of here, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, remanded.
Mm-hmm.
And they go before a judge to make it sure he's expressed concerns. So we have concerns for his own safety, given what he has said.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it's done. And that is the way it has been done for long enough. And in those instances, it's usually a remand for a psychiatric evaluation. You know, there were signs there. That was a very obvious red flag. A man on bail who knows this is serious makes an attempt. Now, it could have been a very low day, but he has shown that he's willing to take a risk, either to seriously injure himself and get himself out of the situation, or to provoke sympathy for the stress that he's going through.
Mm-hmm.
In either instance, nothing was done.
Yeah, and another failure, really, in a catalogue of.
Another failure.
Well, Tanya Fowles, for the moment, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.